In the early 1960s, 4 Agatha Christie movies were made starring Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple, although 2 of those films were based on novels featuring Hercule Poirot. A couple years ago, I contrasted a pair of films adapted from the same Poirot novel. One was from the Rutherford series, the other was an entry in the TV series Agatha Christie's Poirot, starring David Suchet. The Suchet adaptation, of course, was more accurate, but the version in which Poirot had been replaced by Miss Marple won a decisive victory as the better film overall, in my opinion. I think it's time for a rematch. After the Funeral, the 25th novel to feature Poirot, also titled Funerals Are Fatal, was published in 1953. This time, I'm comparing its 2006 TV adaptation with David Suchet and Michael Fassbender to its 1963 feature film adaptation, Murder at the Gallop. When wealthy businessman Richard Abernethy dies from what seem to be natural causes, his family gathers at his funeral: his sister Cora, his sisters-in-law Helen and Maud, his nephew George, his nieces Susan and Rosamond, and their husbands Gregory and Michael. Richard also has a surviving brother Timothy, who doesn't attend the funeral. After the reading of Richard's will, Cora causes an awkward scene when she says,
"He was murdered, wasn't he?"
Oh, Cora!
What a really...
No one takes what she said seriously until Cora herself is murdered with a hatchet. The same events occur at the start of the Suchet adaptation, though a few details have been altered, mainly pertaining to the familial relationships. Susan, now Susanna, is sisters with Rosamond. Her calling is missionary work, and her husband Gregory is left out. Helen and George are now mother and son, and while the book told us none of the relatives felt much grief at Richard's passing, George at least is clearly devastated. It gets even worse for him when Richard's will inexplicably disinherits him, distributing the wealth among everyone else. This surprises everyone, including Timothy, who expected to get nothing at all, another change from the novel in which he expected to get everything. The beginning of the book is told mainly from the points of view of Lanscombe, the butler, and Entwistle, the lawyer, who's a recurring character in the Poirot series. Film Entwistle is much younger than his book counterpart, of whom he's implied to be the son, and he has romantic feelings for Helen. As in the book, he recruits Poirot and brings him up to speed.
Listen, Poirot, you will take the case on, won't you?
Oui, monsieur. I will take the case.
Unsurprisingly, the Margaret Rutherford film diverges from the novel much more radically. Miss Marple and her sidekick, Mr. Stringer, played by Rutherford's real-life husband, Stringer Davis, actually witness the death of Richard, whose last name has been switched with that of his house in the book, Enderby. Richard was reportedly afraid of cats, and they find one, along with signs of a recent visitor. Miss Marple tries to convince the police that Richard's fatal heart attack was deliberately induced. Murder by cat, if you will.
But surely, Inspector, you have read Agatha Christie's remarkable novel, The Ninth Life. Doom came to her victim in the shape of a cat.
Oh, now look, Miss Marple, enough is enough.
There is no such Agatha Christie novel, though there is a short story titled Wireless, or in some publications, Where There's a Will, in which a killer frightens an old woman to death by impersonating her long-dead husband.
Agatha Christie should be compulsory reading for the police force.
Since the police don't take her seriously, Miss Marple decides to solve the case herself. To find out who benefits from Richard's death, she eavesdrops on the will reading. Only 4 of Richard's relatives make it into the film: George, Rosamond, Michael, and Cora. There's also an original character, Hector Enderby, played by Robert Morley. Miss Marple overhears Cora's requisite line.
But he was murdered, wasn't he?
What?
So she pays Cora a visit, only to find her dead, though the murder weapon is changed from a hatchet to a hat pin. In the book, Entwistle begins investigating the mystery himself, and he's not too shabby at it. He's very subtle about probing the suspects for alibis and other information. He does so well, it's almost a surprise when he calls in Poirot, though even then Poirot does not yet take center stage. Cora has left most of her possessions to Susan, who goes down to her cottage for a few days. She meets Miss Gilchrist, Cora's companion, whose main preoccupation is nostalgia for her tea shop, the Willow Tree, lost in the war. Miss Gilchrist says she overheard Richard tell Cora someone was trying to poison him, but she puts it down to senility on his part. She doesn't seem to know anything about Cora's declaration at the funeral, but someone apparently thinks she does, for she receives a piece of wedding cake laced with arsenic, A quick trip to the hospital just manages to save her life. The next part of the book is all over the place, jumping between characters and locations, ultimately underlining that everyone had motive, everyone had opportunity, and we have no idea how Richard, if he was murdered, was murdered. Poirot decides it's time for him to meet the suspects, so he pretends he's bought Enderby as a sanctum for refugees and invites the family to choose keepsakes from the house. To his surprise, Miss Gilchrist comes along, refusing to be left alone. When he questions her, she says the appearance of a nun made her uneasy, but she's not sure why. At this point, the reader realizes that nuns have been appearing repeatedly throughout the book, but we barely noticed it, just as people at the time would hardly notice them in real life. It's hinted that at least 2 of these nuns might have been the same person, possibly even a man in disguise. Perhaps Miss Gilchrist recognized the murderer on a subconscious level. Speaking of recognition, on the day of the funeral, Helen recognized that something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. After listening to a conversation about mirror images, she finally remembers, but when she tries to tell Entwistle, someone attacks her, leaving her concussed. Poirot's increased presence in the film doesn't cause any drastic changes. In fact, it helps streamline the story. At first he pretends that he's only investigating Cora's death and not Richard's, but the family figures out the truth pretty quickly. One added wrinkle is that someone breaks into Entwistle's office and makes off with the deeds to the house, so the family can't get any money. Later, the deeds are found, but by then it's discovered that the will is a fake. The real will, when discovered, leaves everything to George, as they'd expected would happen to begin with. Apart from that, the plot is largely the same, though the characters have some further alterations. First of all, Cora's husband is still alive. His name is now Signor Gallaccio, and although he and Cora were separated, before she died, Cora had asked him to come value a painting. Thus Gallaccio replaces Mr. Guthrie, the art expert from the book. He ends up being invited to Enderby along with the other suspects. Even though Susanna is a missionary, her book counterpart is far more selfless. This character is so privileged and patronizing, she's only likable when she's telling George to get his head out of his ass. Unlike Book George, who's flippant, Film George is a broody train wreck. Lanscombe says he had a violent quarrel with his uncle the day before Richard died, and since then he's been a total dick to his mother. Timothy's history with his brother is changed slightly, but ultimately he's the same insufferable, whiny jerk. His relationship with Maud is different, though. In fact, I noticed a pattern in the book of women being devoted to, shall we say, unlikely men. Susan to socially awkward Gregory, Rosamond to unfaithful Michael, and Maud to her man-baby husband. In the film, these female characters have had a feminist makeover, punctuated by Maud flirting with Signor Gallaccio.
Maud, I need to lie down.
Of course, Timothy.
Last but not least, while Miss Gilchrist in the book is mainly a source of comic relief, in the film she becomes a vehicle for the theme of classism. Even after Poirot invites her to Enderby as a guest, the Abernethys still expect her to behave like a servant, which she's clearly uncomfortable with but helpless to stop. Poirot's the only one who treats her as a human being, and there's a touching scene where they seem to connect. Oh, I almost forgot, the nuns. Nuns do appear occasionally throughout the film, and if you're not watching carefully, you'll miss them, but there's never any question of someone in disguise as a nun. In the end, they serve a different function to the story. Murder at the Gallop changes Miss Gilchrist to Miss Milcrest, and when she finds Miss Marple standing over Cora's body, she accuses her of murder. As in the book, she reports Richard's visit to Cora, and his suspicion that his life was in danger. Miss Marple is concerned for Miss Milchrist's safety, especially when she's invited to stay at the Gallop Hotel, where the Enderbys are gathered. In the end, no attempt is made to poison Miss Milchrist, but the family is all menacing toward her. Miss Marple also goes to stay at the hotel, and the middle of the film is a combination of slapstick comedy and Miss Marple testing suspects' boots to see if they match the footprint she found earlier. At long last, she finds the right boot. It belongs to George. Instead of a lawyer, George is now an art dealer, though his personality is the same as in the book, a suave risk-taker and embezzler. In fact, Michael and Rosamond are pretty book-accurate as well, though in Rosamond's case her personality is closer to Susan's, intelligent, headstrong, a little bit ruthless, and devoted to her husband no matter what. Anyway, Miss Marple thinks George is the killer, but then she overhears him confronting the killer, demanding to know where a valuable painting is. Earlier the family was arguing over a painting of Richard's, so we assume it's the same one. Apparently the killer tells George it's in a particular stall. He goes to search, he's trapped inside, and he's trampled to death. First murder by cat, now murder by horse. Helen does not die of her injury, but she's in a coma, so she can't tell anyone what she remembered. All she managed to say to Entwistle was that she was looking at someone when Cora made her gaffe, and what she saw didn't make sense. Poirot speaks to each suspect one last time before revealing the solution. This clears away a few red herrings, and Gregory confesses, though Poirot ascribes this to a punishment complex. I don't mind that Gregory was left out of both films. The whole case for the murder of Richard, Poirot explains, rests on Cora's last words and her death soon afterward. But when Cora spoke those words, Helen must have seen someone acting strange, and the only person she would have been looking at when Cora was speaking was Cora herself. That was not Cora at the funeral. She'd been drugged and left in the cottage. The only person who could have seen through the disguise was her brother, Timothy, and he wasn't there. It was Miss Gilchrist posing as Cora. She hinted at Richard having been murdered so that when she killed Cora, everyone would think it had to do with Richard and the family. Later, she poisoned herself to strengthen that theory. How did Poirot see through her smokescreen? While at Enderby, Miss Gilchrist mentioned a certain set of flowers, but those flowers had been broken before she arrived. She must have seen them the first time she was here, as Cora. Cora had left her a painting which she was unaware was quite valuable. Miss Gilchrist wanted to sell it and recreate her tea shop, the Willow Tree, and win back her independence. In the book, Helen recovers from her attack, and near the end she tells Poirot a secret, which kind of made it into the Suchet film. After his mother is attacked, George finally breaks down and admits he was the one who faked the will, to disinherit himself. Why would he do this? In the book, Helen's secret was that she'd had a love child with a married man, whom she brought up in Cyprus as her nephew. In the film, George is her love child, and Richard is his secret father. That's why George has been such a jerk this whole time. He's been coping not only with the shame of being illegitimate, but also the guilt of having caused his own father's death by fighting with him, or so he believes. A few other twists are added to the film. Timothy and Maud conspired to steal the deeds, but when it turned out they were heirs, or so they thought, they tried to return them without getting caught. Rosamond, like in the book, is secretly pregnant, but the day after the funeral she went to have an abortion, and then changed her mind.
There's going to have to be big changes, Michael.
Susanna's secret, like in the book, is that she went to see Aunt Cora the day she was murdered, but in this case she never made it to the cottage because she and George slept together.
We're cousins. It's all wrong.
Oh, honey, go watch Game of Thrones. As for the nuns, since no one ever suspects a nun impersonator, they serve as a reminder that there are certain people we tend not to look at very carefully, again giving us the theme of classism.
One doesn't bother to look at a mere companion help, a domestic drudge.
Murder at the Gallop gives us a more suspenseful climax in which Miss Milcrest puts on her Cora disguise and tries to give Miss Marple a fatal heart attack. The solution is the same, but it's unclear whether Miss Milcrest lied about Richard being murdered, as she did in the book, or if she actually killed him. If she did kill him, then the whole thing's a little far-fetched. If she didn't, then they gloss over the fact that Miss Marple was wrong. At the end, Hector proposes to Miss Marple, she declines, and he invites her to go on a fox hunt, to which she replies,
I'm very sorry, Mr. Enderby, but I disapprove of blood sports.
I knew she was cool. Well, in terms of plot and character, the Suchet version is again more accurate to the book, despite its embellishments. There was only one major element that the Rutherford film keeps, or at least represents, that gets altered in the Suchet. When Miss Marple spies on the will reading, the lawyer reads aloud Richard's summation of each of his family members, which is reminiscent of how Book Richard visited with each of his relatives in order to choose his successor, and decides none of them is worthy. The Miss Marple film is a great suspense comedy. But as a film and as a mystery, the 2006 rendition is by far the stronger. The characters and relationships are much more compelling. We actually care about what's going on with these people. Every change made from the original story only makes it more engaging. I love the "I faked the will to disinherit myself" twist. I don't think that's been done anywhere else. I would still recommend both of these films, but the David Suchet stands out both as an adaptation and as a movie unto itself. Philomena McDonough, excellent job. There are a lot more Poirot and Miss Marple stories I want to cover, but this year I'll try to make sure the standalones also get their due. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for watching.